Welcome to the Elliott School of International Affairs in beautiful Washington, D.C., and to our series, Envisioning India. I'm James Foster, the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it, at the George Washington University, welcoming you to our conversation with Karthik Muralidharan and Rukmini Banerji, entitled Schooling in India's New Education Policy and Impact of COVID on Learning Outcomes. Thank you both for joining us here in DC from California and Delhi. In just a moment, distinguished visiting scholar at IIEP, Ajay Chhibber, who organized the series, will set the stage and formally introduce our guests. But first, I'd like to thank the Seeger Center for Asian Studies in the Elliott School for co-sponsoring today's event, and also IIEP's Executive Circle, and especially the new co-chair, Frank Wong, for continued support. I'd also like to welcome our new dean, Alyssa Ayres, to the Elliott School from the Council on Foreign Relations, where she's been senior fellow for South Asia. Now, for those of you who haven't attended a previous IIEP event, you can expect a nonpartisan, lively, and informative conversation on such topics as US-China economic relations, multidimensional poverty, global economic governance, climate change, and digital trade. Our last Envisioning India episode featured Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah discussing India's slowdown in growth. In our China conference series, David Michael Lampton and Deborah Lair recently had a conversation on the state of US-China relationships. Next week, on the 15th of February, Betsy Stevenson will discuss gender inequality and COVID in our Facing Inequality series. And on the 24th, our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series presents Governing Finance for Sustainable Prosperity, presented by Alex Barkawi of the Council on Economic Policies. If you can't make an event synchronously, videos can be found on our YouTube channel at IIEP-GW. Now, over to my distinguished colleague, Ajay Chhibber. Professor.
Thank you very much, James, and welcome to all of you to this very exciting event today on the India Envisioning series. Just to quickly put in a plug, in next month in March, we will have Mr. N.K. Singh, who's the chairman of the Finance Commission of India, speaking. But today we are in for a very exciting treat for all of us. India's demographic dividend has been much talked about, but unless India can educate its children, future citizens, that demographic dividend could become, or is actually becoming, or already, I'm worried, a demographic disaster. Somehow, I don't understand why India is able to send rockets to the moon. It can run elections in one of the world's biggest democracy, but it's unable to somehow to educate its children. Today, we have two, I think, in my mind, two of the best minds, and both in terms of analytics and practice on this subject. We have Karthik Muralidharan, who is the Tata Chancellor Professor at UCS San Diego. And he's, I don't want to read his entire CV to you, but to my mind, he's probably done the most amount of work in this area, both in terms of thinking about it, but also in terms of actually running a whole series of experiments through the JPAL that he is the director of for education. So I can think of no better person than him to elucidate us on this subject. And joining him is Rukmini Banerji. She's the CEO of Pratham. I don't know if anybody has not heard of Pratham, but Pratham is an organization that has been doing an enormous amount of work in India on learning outcomes. I first met Rukmini, I think in 2013 or 2013, if I remember, going to their offices in Delhi, and I was so amazed by the work that they were doing, and I've become an avid follower of Pratham. The ASER report that Pratham produces is awaited every year as much as the budget of India that the finance minister provides, because it gives us a complete window on what's happening in the education sector. So I can think of no better people than the two of them to join us in a kind of a jugalbandi. We'll have it's more like a panel session where we'll have 15 minutes first of each of them, and then a second round. Maybe I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So over to you, Karthik, first. Thank you so much for joining us so early for you on the west coast of the United States.
So first of all, thank you so much to Ajay and James for the series, and I'm delighted to be here with Rukmini. And this is a topic on which we can talk for a very long time, and I'm going to try and be disciplined and take 15 minutes to just give you a sense of the big picture on both the facts and the evidence on school education in India. This is very much about schooling, and then I think the plan is for Rukmini to spend a lot more time sharing insights from the ground, including potential impacts of COVID, and then we'll turn back to talking about policy and how the research and the evidence and the field understanding of how education is working should translate into policy and practice. So just as a quick background and some of the key facts. I think before we start beating ourselves up too much on kind of the state of Indian education, it is important to first acknowledge the glass half full. And the glass half full is the substantial successes in school enrollment in the past 15 years. So, and a lot of this is from Pratham's own data that over 97% of children are now enrolled in school. And this is a massive success given where we started about 20 to 25 years ago. And the other good news from getting the enrollment rate so high is that a lot of the inequalities have kind of by construction come down. So you can't get to 97, 98% enrollment without managing to enroll pretty much all your historically disadvantaged and marginalized groups. And so in that sense, the glass half full is both the increase in enrollment and kind of the reduction in enrollment gaps. But very quickly, you look at the other side, and the glass half empty story is that this enormous investments of both time and money, right? The money in terms of the budget and the time in terms of the children who are actually spending these years in school, the productivity of the investments of time in school seems to be abysmally low. And you have incredibly low learning outcomes. And it's Rukmini and Pratham who really deserve the lion's share of the credit for making this issue salient in the national consciousness with their annual ASER reports. But this is also corroborated with multiple other data sets, as well as more detailed data collection in individual states where we've had research studies going. Now, the default approach to sector level activists, when you say, we want to improve education, is you typically think that the problem is one of not spending enough. And so, and part of India's problem is that we always think about our commitments to sectors in terms of the budgetary allocation, and not just India. This is true everywhere in the world. So in that sense, it just reflects the fact that budgets are visible in a way that outcomes are not. Okay. And so, Ajay, in some ways, I think that's why ASER is, I would argue, even more valuable than the budget. The budget, you can go look at the CAG report and see how they spent it. Without ASER, you would actually not even know what's going on in learning outcomes. And so I think once you kind of unpeel the onion and look at how this money is being spent, what you see is that the large increases in spending, as well as the right to education, which is the RTE Act, do not seem to have helped or improved learning outcomes, and some components may even have hurt. So a lot of the research, which I'll talk about, tries to shed some light on how exactly inputs are mapping into outcomes and why it may not be nearly as effective as we think it may be. And I think coming back to Ajay's question about why is India not able to do this, I don't think anybody questions. I think this is one of those topics where there should be agreement across the left, right, and center that to the extent that as a government and a society, what we care about is inclusive growth. You want rapid growth rates and you want people to be able to participate in that process, that improving the quality of schooling is an essential foundation, both in terms of the human capital that will power economic growth and jobs, as well as the inclusion in terms terms of what will allow individual citizens to participate in that growth process. So this is consistent with both micro evidence and macro evidence and should be pretty uncontroversial. But I think recognizing the importance of skills, what you're seeing is that citizens are kind of not waiting for the government. Okay, so there's been large-scale exit to private schools, where in urban India, the estimated market share of fee charging private schools is around 60 to 70%, and even in rural India, that's at about 30 to 35%. Okay, so people are voting with their feet, moving to private schools. But as I'm not going to have time to cover private schools in today's talk, maybe I can discuss a little bit in the Q&A. But at least, you know, it doesn't appear that the private schools are going to be a panacea in their current form. They are marginally better and they're certainly more cost effective. But in terms of absolute learning outcomes, they are not that much better. So we can come back and talk about regulatory architectures to improve the performance of private schools. But, you know, that's just the context in which we are. And like Ajay said, you know, I think the lack of skills and employability, you know, this is something I've been saying now for 15 years. And unfortunately, 15 years ago, I would say this risks turning the demographic dividend into a demographic disaster. I think we're already at a point where the disaster is here. And, you know, we've got multiple states that are now already hitting replacement fertility levels, which means that that window that you had is pretty much over. And there really isn't much time left to take this problem on a war footing. So just in terms of some aggregate facts, and you know, this is just a very stark overlaying of budgets and outcomes. And so what you see is there's been, you know, a near quadrupling of per pupil expenditure. Now, of course, this is nominal, and after you adjust for inflation, you'll still get an over doubling of real expenditure in this period. But learning outcomes from ASER data suggest that for the most part, this is flat or may even be declining. So this mapping is pretty weak. Okay, so I'm going to try and take about 5 minutes in one slide to synthesize almost 20 years of work, not just, you know, including by Esther Duflo and Ajay Banerji, you know, who won the Nobel a couple of years ago for their work on RCTs, much of this in education. And so, but just to give you a sense of the big picture categories of expenditure that we have in public schooling and give you a sense of why this doesn't seem to be having much impact. So the first thing we spend money on infrastructures. Now, school construction in new areas where there was no schools does help. It helps with enrollment, and it also helps in learning outcomes relative to a counterfactual where there is no school. Okay, so the issue here is not about school, but the issue here is about all the infrastructure upgradation that we're doing, whether it's building compound walls or building toilets or building other or computer labs or libraries. And for the most part, we're not seeing any correlation with increases in learning outcomes. So this is in panel data, not experimental. But, you know, the question of what's going on is a big puzzle. And there's three possible explanations. I think the first is that the infrastructure and facilities make it more comfortable to be in school, but they don't really affect learning outcomes. And what matters for learning outcomes is what's going on in terms of teaching and learning. And you know, there's a very nice study by Fabian Waldinger looking at post-World War II German universities. And what he finds is that, you know, some universities had a random reduction in physical capital from their bombings during World War II. And some universities had kind of a quasi-exogenous variation in human capital because universities with more Jewish faculty lost a lot more of their faculty. And I think what he finds is that 10 to 15 years after World War II, the universities that lost their buildings had completely recovered, whereas about 50 years later, the universities that lost their faculty had still not recovered in terms of their research productivity. Okay, so it just kind of highlights the centrality of the teaching and the teachers. There's a second possibility here, which is that often you buy materials and build infrastructure, but this doesn't get used. Okay, so if you take the case of toilet construction, so what we saw in our matched data in Andhra Pradesh. Now, of course, this is from 2008, 2010, and things may have changed a little bit. But what we saw in 70% of the cases where the schools actually had a toilet, the children were still relieving themselves in the open. And two big drivers of this was, one, there was no running water to clean the toilet, and second, there was nobody appointed to clean the toilet. And so the teacher would often rather just have this locked up. So it just gives you a sense that the infrastructure by itself may not get used. And I can give you more recent stories about computer labs that are locked up because the teachers and head teachers are more worried that they'll get into trouble if a computer is stolen, whereas there's really nothing in there to make sure that the children are actually using this. So I think the non-use of facilities is in fact a non-trivial factor. And the last one is that infrastructure may well matter, but matter over a depreciation life cycle of 20 years, because that's how long a capital good will last, but that we don't seem to have enough, it's not seem to mattering enough in the 1 year, 2 year horizons in which we're measuring this. Okay, so I'm not going to come here and say don't build infrastructure. I'm just going to say it's clearly, it may be necessary, but it's clearly not sufficient. Okay, so that's kind of the main story on infrastructure. So then you get this big push on teacher quality and teacher training. Okay, and the Right to Education highlights this a lot. And again, there's not a single study that finds a positive correlation between teacher training credentials and learning outcomes. Okay, so and again, it's a sense of, I would say, and maybe I'll come back to this in discussion, about how in the last 20 years, so much of our focus before that has been on budgets, but the research has allowed us to get into the black box of what's going on inside classrooms to figure out what truly matters. Okay, and the three possible explanations for this is that one, a lot of these teacher training certificates are fake and there's a bunch of degree mills, so it's not surprising that wouldn't have an impact. But the second is, even if you look at authentic teacher training degrees where kids have studied for their exams and gotten qualified, is that the content, if you do a content analysis of teacher training, almost all of this is on focusing on history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, with very little training on actual pedagogy. And so when you show up in a classroom with 25 screaming kids, your training for the most part hasn't really spoken to the practical component of these jobs. Now, things are changing here, but I think that's an important caveat to keep in mind. And I think the last point goes to governance, which I'll talk about, is that even when the teacher training gives you the ability to be a better teacher, when you're put in an environment of public schooling where there is really no focus on outcomes and no recognition for outcomes, there's very little kind of motivation to use that capacity that you have in the training. So we have multiple studies showing that the business as usual effect of training is zero. But when you put a little bit of performance linked pay in a set of schools, that the trained teachers, in fact, do much better. Okay, so one way to think about this is that if quality is a function of both knowledge and effort, that the knowledge will only matter when the effort is also high. And so if you invest a lot in knowledge without effort, you actually don't get the returns to that. Okay, and we see similar evidence in health, which I can talk about later. Now, similarly with teacher quantity, which is kind of hiring more teachers. And here, we do get modest positive effects of reducing class size. The problem is that the way we do this is incredibly cost ineffective through hiring regular government teachers who are, who are very expensive. And what the evidence shows is that you can use locally hired volunteers, teachers with a 12 standard credential or even 10 standard from the same village. And this is shown up in Pratham's work, it's shown up in my work. And you robustly find, right, that these locally hired teachers are at least as effective, if not more effective, than teachers who are more educated, more qualified and paid much higher salaries. And there's multiple reasons for this, including the accountability that comes from being in a contract and the social connection that comes from living in the village, as opposed to a highly distant last mile teacher and service delivery infrastructure we have. And the last point is student inputs. Okay, so we spend tons of money on midday meals, books, uniforms, and materials, and again there is limited to weak evidence of impact on learning outcomes. Okay, so again, I'm not going to say that you should not do these things, okay, because midday meals are almost an ethical imperative, but the mapping between some of that spending and learning outcomes seems to be pretty weak. And and in terms of what is going on, there's really two broad classes of explanations. One is we do have evidence of substitution, that when you provide things in the school, the household will spend less on these things. Okay, now again, that's not necessarily a bad thing because these are poor households and you're saving them the money, but from a policy perspective, it may explain why the translation of these inputs into outcomes may be weaker because it is attenuated by offsetting behavior by households. But I think the even more important thing is that the binding constraints may be somewhere else. Okay, so which is what I'm going to now switch to. And this slide is very, very depressing, right? Because I go to the IS Academy and present to top government officials, because 95% of what the government does is basically this, right? They focus on inputs, they focus on hiring, they focus on quality and training and student inputs, right? And the problem is that none of this seems to matter as much for learning outcomes. So what does matter? Does anything work? Okay, so on the optimistic side, what we've seen is there is very robust evidence of two classes of interventions that seem to matter again and again. And the first is just basic governance. Okay, and governance is a combination of monitoring and supervision. So we estimate, based on 2010 salaries, that the annual fiscal cost of teacher absence alone is about 10,000 crores a year. Okay, so we did the study in 2003 where the absence was about 26%. We went back to the same villages in 2010, and you found substantial improvements in all kinds of inputs, but the teacher absence had barely budged. And the only thing that mattered was, had your school been visited by a superior officer sometime in the past 3 months. And so what we estimate coming back to a unifying theme across a lot of work is, see, why do we hire more teachers? We hire more teachers because we want to improve pupil-teacher contact time, okay? But you can increase that contact time two ways. You can increase it by hiring more teachers, or you can increase it by improving the governance of the existing system. And what we estimate is that if you fill the supervisory vacancies, which is staggering in terms of how large the vacancies are. So I have a whole book on state capacity, which I consider talking about, but that maybe we'll do that in the fall. But what we estimate that just filling these basic supervision gaps would be about 10 times more cost effective than spending more on inputs itself. I've already talked about how locally hired contract teachers are at least as effective, if not more effective, at a much lower cost. And I've got this other large-scale RCT that studied the effect of unconditional doubling of teacher salaries. Okay, so government of Indonesia did this major reform, and we did this RCT at scale, and that paper is called Double for Nothing. Okay, and that's because the unconditional increase in government salaries has absolutely zero correlation with improved outcomes. Okay, and basically, if you look at where our money goes, that once you have these pay commissions, the salaries absorb like pretty much all of the money you have, and there's very, very little funds left for other things. Okay, which matter a lot more. And in contrast, having even a modest amount of pay that is linked to performance, very modest, and we can talk about that later, had dramatically positive impacts. Okay, so it's just highlighting, the point of this is not to say that any of these specific things should be scaled up, but it's just to highlight from a public return on investment perspective how much better you will do by improving governance as opposed to just spending more in a business as usual way. Okay, so now let's get to the second big part of the story. And this is, now think for a moment, forget the absent teacher, okay? Think about the highly motivated teacher. And this is somebody who really cares about education. They come to class, they're diligent, they do their work. Now, the problem is, how does this teacher typically construct his or her notion of being a good teacher? And that is completing the textbook, okay? So you have a textbook, you have a curriculum, you have lesson plans, and you come and you have a plan that says each class, each week, this is what I'm going to do. And the problem is that the textbooks and curricula, and this is, of course, Rukmini and Pratham, this is essentially their insight and backed up by work from Esther and Abhijit, is that, textbooks and curricula are designed for a time when schooling was far from universal and therefore was catering pretty much to the right end of the distribution. Whereas what you have is tens of millions of first generation learners who've entered the schooling system who don't have the household support needed. And so if they fall behind early, they basically never catch up. Okay. And so you now have evidence from multiple studies, and this is again Pratham's core idea of teaching at the right level, that's been validated in several studies across multiple states and countries. And you're also starting to see some very promising results on technology-aided interventions that precisely target instruction to the learning level of the child. Okay, so let me kind of put you this one picture, which is coming from very recent ongoing work. And I consider this to be, potentially the most important picture for understanding Indian education. Now, many of us have conjectured this for a long time, but we haven't had the data. So what is this picture showing? Okay, so on the left-hand side, if you look at the math graph, so this is coming from data from 4 districts in Rajasthan in integrated other schools from class 1 to 8, but we're seeing exactly the same pattern in Delhi. We're seeing the same pattern in Madhya Pradesh. So, but this is the largest sample in schools that go all the way from 1 to 8, which is why I'm showing you this. Okay, and what is this picture showing is that the x-axis is the child is the grade in which the child is enrolled in. Okay, 1 to all the way up to class 8. The y-axis is based on this adaptive diagnostic test of what is the level of ability or knowledge that is assessed for the child. Now, the 45-degree line, the blue line, is where you would want to be if children were keeping pace with the curriculum. Okay, whereas the red line tells you where the average learning levels is. And so what you're seeing is that the rate at which children are progressing through the school system is roughly half of what is envisaged in the curriculum. So by the time you get to class 8, about your average child is at a learning level of a 4th grade level. Okay, so now that's kind of striking enough, but in a way, we already know from Pratham's work that children are not at learning level, at grade appropriate standards. Okay, so I think the real aha for me in this picture is what you see is that each dot in this picture is 10 children. Okay, and so what you're seeing is the staggering variation of learning levels within a given classroom. Okay, so if you look at this grade 8 on the x-axis, I have children at a second grade level, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth. Okay, now to a large extent, this reflects our no detention policy, where you're pushing children through to higher grades regardless of their learning level. So it was well intentioned with a view of preventing dropouts, but it has created this other perverse problem of children sitting in higher grades without having a clue of what's going on in the classroom. And so now, if you think about the teacher's job is almost impossible, right? So as a teacher, how on earth do I handle that kind of variation in a classroom where I've got children spanning from grade 2 to grade 8? And so the teacher will default into completing the textbook and the curriculum, because that's kind of what that's what the exams are doing. And Rukmini, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so so when you look at this picture, and particularly in the US, right? Like one striking question that comes up, which I keep hearing from many of my listeners in the US, is, we thought India had the best education system in the world, right? When you look around, you see Indians just doing enormously well everywhere. The CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of Google, the CEO of IBM, the chancellor of my university, they're all products of the Indian education system. Okay, so the question is, how do you make sense of this, of the fact that we have all of this, all of this success on one side and these staggering failures on the other? And one way to think about this is that education systems historically have served two very, very different functions. Okay, so there is the human development function, which is saying, how do I teach everybody? But there is also the sorting and screening function, which says, how do I identify who is smart? Okay, and the one way to understand the Indian education system is that we are fundamentally not an education system. What we are is a filtration system. Okay, so the system is characterized by high stakes, difficult exams at every stage, and what matters is, are you passing those exams? And so the people you see in the US are kind of the top 1% of the distribution, the extreme right tail, and so they're going to do great things, but it's basically a selection story. Okay, and so when you go down and look at the weeds of Indian education, I think the existential problem for us is, for all the policies that you do, you can have inputs, you can have training, is that the ethos of the system is fundamentally a selection-oriented system, which is, how do I identify and how do I get kids who are jumping past these hoops? But if you're not passing those hoops, the system pretty much abandons you. Okay, so so I would say the single most important mindset shift we need in building an education system for the 21st century is, how do you move from a selection paradigm to a human development paradigm that says, regardless of where you are, am I improving your learning level so that you're better tomorrow than where you were yesterday? Okay, and once you have that even at the lower end of the distribution is going to be the foundation of skilling and other job training and other capacity building that is essential for people to participate in the broader process of economic growth. And then I think I'm out of time, but I'll come back and talk about the policy implications of this in the second round. But I think from a research perspective, I just wanted to leave this picture in your mind to then make sense of why is all our spending not having an impact. And that's because you're not addressing the binding constraint. So Michael Kramer and co-authors had this very nice study in Kenya where they looked at the impact of giving free textbooks to kids, and again they found zero impact, right? But when they looked at the data more carefully, they saw that it's the top 20% of the learning distribution that benefited from the kids, because those are from the textbooks, because those are the only kids who could read. So the average kid couldn't even read. And so a lot of the ineffectiveness of policies sometimes comes from the cognitive disconnect of kind of how we think about the binding constraints are, which seems perfectly reasonable to think, oh, I should give you books, but if the binding constraint is that the kids can't read, then a lot of your inputs may not translate into outcomes. So let me stop there and and hand over to Rukmini.
Fantastic. Rukmini?
Fantastic, Karthik. In the Jugalbandi, you are the singer. I just have to play the drums on the side. Okay. What I thought I would do is do two things. And again, I want to make sure we have enough time to talk. I want to talk a little bit about how do you, what I'm calling, seize the moment. We have many things to do. We had many things to do before. And after, during the pandemic, and pandemic is still on, although everybody in India is, I think, pretending it's gone. We need to think about, how we can put together everything we've heard and we know and forge the best way forward. And we've just had this new education policy that was released some months ago. And so I think it's a very good moment for stirring the pot and for seeing, what are possibilities. So if we can go to the next slide, I just wanted to lay out, someone helping me with the slides, right? Okay. So the new education policy, I just want to lay it out here, talks about many things, but fundamentally it breaks the 8 years of compulsory schooling and adds actually the pre-primary years, and talks about foundational years, the preparatory years, and the middle school years. Standard is the same as grade, more or less, and so you can see the age and the grade here. And among the key things that the new education policy says is puts this very important focus on the basic reading and math in primary grades, along with a timeline. And so I think Karthik has already spoken quite a lot about it. I thought I would just go ahead and say that let's see what we can do about this foundations in primary grades, especially after a year of schools having been closed. If we go to the next slide, this is just to get the conversation moving ahead. For those who may not have seen what the ASER tool looks like, I hope there is no such person in the audience, but just in case, this is the reading tool that is used in the ASER survey. Very simple, letters, words, a small 4-line paragraph, which is usually at first grade level, and then a longer story at second grade level. And this is basically the very, very simple tool we've been using all along. It helps in many different ways, but particularly it helps illiterate parents or parents who don't have much education really get a fix on what is this whole basic learning that we are talking about. Next slide, please. What I've done is, on the next slide, if we can move to it, I pulled out the last big ASER survey that was done, which was in 2018, which is a national sample, very large sample, over 500,000 children. And if I had to describe, according to me, what I think is the core data that should feed into the new education policy's main thrust, this would be the table I would pull out. And I think I'm saying pretty much the same thing as Karthik. I'm just saying it in a different way. And I'm saying it in a way that practitioners, parents, community members, teachers can all understand. And basically what it is that a normal school system is let's say, if you want to visualize a normal school system, I would say that it's organized by rows. So every grade is a row, and every grade is usually associated with a certain age. And if I look at India for grade 3, 4, and 5 in 2018, it looks more or less like this. And it's exactly the same in a simple table as what Karthik showed. It shows that at every grade level, there is a lot of variation. So the blue cell that you have here, which is a third grade, and a third grade, kids in the third grade who are reading at least at second grade level. So let's say these are kids who are at third grade level. Across the country, this has private schools, government schools, everyone. About less than 30% kids are at grade level. And you can see from this table that not only are only 30% kids at grade level, there is something like, let's say 12 plus 22, 34, another 50% who are not even at first grade level as yet. And they've reached third grade. And the same way, if you go to the fifth grade, you can see half the kids are at least at second grade level, but there is a long, and I don't know why we always call it tail of the distribution. This is not a tail. The body of the distribution is stretched across many different learning levels. And so this is what we have. This is the reality. And we can think about what a fifth grade teacher has to do. On the one hand, the right to education, which is a law, says that she has to complete the syllabus for the year, which in her mind is the fifth grade textbook. But we can see from the fifth grade distribution here that the ASER does not even look at who's at fifth grade, but we know that at least 50% kids in her class are not even at second grade level. So this is where she's stuck. and this is what she has to deal with. The next slide actually just lays out this variation in even more graphic terms. If we can go to the next one. These are states in India. And what I've done is I've pulled out from the ASER data from 2018, how many kids are at grade level in third grade. Massive variation from the top states who are not only almost half the kids are at grade level, but a very large chunk are very close behind, to states where, 10, 15% are at grade level, and their friends and counterparts are way, way behind. And so this is what we have to deal with. This is what the national education policy, you have to, of course, naturally know one size doesn't fit all, but we have the same curriculum framework for the whole country, same kinds of textbooks for the whole country, but there's massive variation across states and, massive variations in all kinds of different places. So where do we go from here? Next slide. So, and then along comes COVID. That was a situation which we had in 2018. You can already see that huge amounts of things needed to be done. And along comes COVID. And the schools are just about beginning to reopen in India. The senior schools have opened because they have exams by whenever, in March or April. Middle schools in some states are just beginning. Primary schools haven't yet opened. Big concern about so many things across the world as well as in India. And a big fear that the situation was not good and things are going to get worse. And we know that, if you didn't learn to swim, you would have sunk in 2018. And if you haven't learned to swim still now, then 2021, you're still not going to be able to stay afloat. So what we've been thinking is, based on what we know, based on the data that we have, ASER gives you at least a view all the way going back. And this is a particular state, UP, which is our biggest state. And we thought, let's look at what is the year-on-year gain in normal years. And from Karthik's slide as well, the red line that he had, that these are all, we're looking at across grade, across year. This slide tries to pick out taking up one cohort. The cohorts are colored. I don't know if this is clearly visible or not, but I have the cohorts in different colors. Up to 2014, we did ASER every year, and then 15 and 17 were gap years, but you can still sort of extrapolate. And what we see, and I've put the numbers in the lower table, is that year on year, depending on the grade, depending on the cohort, depending on the particular year, let's say in UP, my red dotted box shows you that there was anywhere between 5 to 10 percentage point increase in the ability of children to read this kind of a text that I show you here, a second grade level text. And that's the kind of range. And in recent years, the blue box, the blue dotted box, recent years, higher grades, the higher end of the cohort moving into higher grades shows, let's say, a 10 to 15 percentage points. There's lots of numbers there, but that's the kind of range. So we know what a normal year, normal cohorts look like. We also know from some of the research that Karthik cited, that researchers at JPAL, Abhijit Esther, I think Karthik's own work has shown that some of this, there are learning improvement programs that can be successful. So let's look at what those have done vis-a-vis what is possible in a normal year. And the next slide is kind of one example. So question is, given what has happened year on year, what is possible? Is there evidence to show that you can significantly go ahead of the year on year? The example that I cite is actually data from the UP's own school system. It's a huge school system, as you can see. And we know from the previous slide that we saw anywhere between, depending on the grades and all of that, 5 to 15 percentage points possibility. Now in 1819, Pratham partnered with the Uttar Pradesh government to design a program which was based on the teaching at the right level approach. And so really a lot of this, doesn't matter which grade you're in, And in fact, if I can just go a couple of slides back to the first table, Kyle, if you could just help me to do that. It illustrates this point very easily. No, the previous one to this, the table just before this. So all that was done, all that teaching at the right level does is, rather than organize instruction by rows, you do it by columns. And it's the same set of resources, it's the same kids, it's the same teachers. But what you do is to say, let's start at the level of the child. Doesn't matter if you're in grade 4 or grade 3 or grade 5. If you're struggling with words, let's come together. Let's do a set of appropriate activities. And as soon as you do that, we've seen over and over again and showed by RCTs that kids make good progress. So if I go back to the slide that we were on, when we did a program like this with the UP school system, done by their own teachers in their own schools, but oriented like this, with kind of coherent leadership from top to bottom, for a whole variety of reasons, it was implemented for just about 2 months or a bit more. We saw this kind of a learning gain, and depending on whether I'm looking at a grade 3 or a grade 4, I can see pretty much a 14, 15, 16, 17 percentage point gain in this short period of time of 60 or 70 years when this was done across the school system. So what does this tell us? It tells us that in an average year, you have this kind of, maybe even if I say 15 percentage point gain, if you get down to it, focus the effort, put the curriculum aside, put your grade level curriculum aside, group children at the right level, in 2 months, you can get an annual improvement done. Now, if you had done this in the beginning of the year and put in even more focus, then, I mean, let's say if you had 20 percentage point improvement in, 60 days, I mean, is it just a linear extrapolation or multiple or whatever? I mean, there's all kinds of things we can think about. So I've just pulled the next slide is these kinds of efforts. Again, this is administrative data, but there have been RCTs done on this. This is a bunch of different states which have used the teaching at the right level approach, different kinds of grades, different number of days, different, I mean, you can see the UP had, 8 million children who did this. Everywhere you see a much better than your annual business as usual learning gain. And therefore, when schools open, and I'm sure this will come up in the discussion, and Karthik, maybe you know the Jishnu paper better than I do. I think that it's worth referring to that the key of what happens now is on what we do when schools open. And the nice thing, I mean, if there's any nice thing about COVID, I think that one good thing is that we can blame every bad thing that has happened in the world on COVID. We don't need to go back historically. We can just start from where we are. And therefore, where I'd like to leave all of you with this thought, which is just captured, I think, in the next slide, is to say that if we put aside our over-ambitious curriculum, and if we go to the evidence that we have from the studies that have been done in India at least, and I think now being maybe in other places as well, if you start at the level of the child and use very simple methods, I mean, we are also in a situation where the economy is doing very badly. There's not going to be a lot of extra money to spend on a lot of things in education, at least. But even with the resources we have, even in weak functioning systems like Uttar Pradesh, you were able to see specific gains if you align your system to coherently go after these foundational goals. Last thing is, in the ASER 2020, which was a very unusual ASER done on the phone, really to explore what's going on at home, we saw a lot of support from parents, family members, siblings, and communities. And all of that help also needs to be captured somewhere. So my strong recommendation for anyone who's listening, and I can see there is 50 people listening, I hope the important decision makers of India are listening. And Karthik, if they are not, you convince them that when schools open, let's get ready to do this catch up and build back better campaign. And I've been floating this idea that let's do a 100-day campaign. Politicians love 100 days for some reason. Let's do a 100-day campaign, repeat it if necessary. But I see the possibility of using everything we know, of being able to come back and actually come back better than we were before. So with this hope, I hand you back to you, James.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. Both wonderful presentations filled with data and recommendations. Thank you so much. I want to invite our audience to use the Q&A function in order to give us questions over the next period of time. There'll be some really good chance for discussion, but first I would like to turn it over to Ajay Chhibber for the first question. Please proceed, Professor.
Thank you, James. Well, that was a treat. I don't know who's playing the sitar and who's doing the tabla, but that was just fantastic. Now, I mean, I have so many questions, but I don't want to kind of flood the whole thing with my questions. But, you know, of course, one thing that struck me very much in the data that you presented, Rukmini, was Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is supposed to be one of India's most advanced states, but in your results, it sort of, you know, drops way to the bottom. And I don't know if there's something there that helps us understand what is going on better. I mean, I have, Karthik is of course probably originally from Tamil Nadu, and I have traveled in Tamil Nadu quite a bit. And whichever village I went to, I would ask them questions about how much they could read and write. You know, I would kind of make sure that I asked that question. Of course, somebody was translating it for me into Tamil, but that's something that struck me. But I also traveled once in Udaipur at Seva Mandir with my good friend Ajay Mehta runs. And what struck me there was the little school that they ran was so popular, and right across this, with two-room school with probably one or two teachers, and across the street was. So when we talk about public and private, it was a government school which had all the equipment, but like you described it, Karthik, that they were afraid of the computer being stolen or something like that. So when we talk about public and private, and in countries like Bangladesh, you have this the third sector taking over a lot of these services. How do you see that? I mean, instead of pouring money into government schools, if you could scale up NGO-run schools, would that be an option for us going forward? I'll turn it back to you, Rukmini, first, and then to Karthik.
Yeah, I would say that I'm sure Karthik will, has done a lot of work on the private and government school differences and so on. I think it's parents, it's not the school. I think in both cases, if you control for who the parents are, you see, how kids do from families which have some advantage, educated parents, learning support at home and so on. But Ajay, I was hoping that what my charts would show is that if you put in a very focused effort in the government schools, you can actually see quite big changes. In UP, the almost 50% of kids go to private school even in rural areas, but it's the lowest 50% who go to government schools. And if you put in a big push there, you can actually see some big change. There's an RCT that was done in Bihar that JPAL did with some work that we were doing with the Bihar government, which showed that the same teacher in the same government schools, when during the school year they were tied to their curriculum, there was hardly any learning gain, kind of like the picture that Karthik shows. In the summer holidays, when they had a summer camp of 1 month, where you really could do teaching at the right level, there was higher gains than what has happened in the whole school year. So it's really that, yes, there are differences between types of schools and types of families, but I think the lid that is holding all of this down is this overambitious, tight curriculum, and we can't blame teachers for that alone. It is what is required of the system. So if you look at, if you look at the low-cost private schools, government schools, all of whom I think could benefit hugely from a big dose of starting where the kids are, building the foundational skills. And I think that the combination of COVID and the new education policy provides this opportunity to go after this in a big way. Karthik?
Yeah, so I'll say three things. I think one, let me just talk about about curriculum and exams. I think one thing that I didn't have time, and I have written this paper for the NEP, which you can link and send to your attendees, is I think the tail that wags the dog of the entire education system is the exam system, right? So what motivates what the parents are doing, what the teachers are doing, what the students are doing is, how do I pass this exam? And because the function of the system has been about sorting, the reason, so coming back to Rukmini's, why do we have this overambitious curriculum, right? You have this overambitious curriculum because you are trying to sort and identify who are your smartest and most kind of high scoring kids who can pass that hurdle. Okay, so there's this worry that if I simplify the curriculum, then am I dumbing things down, am I lowering standards? And so, but this is a very fundamental problem for the design of education systems anywhere in the world, and that goes back to kind of this cognitive disconnect between these two very different functions I talked about, right? So there's the human development function, the sorting function, the status quo makes perfect sense, and that's why you have such a high standard. So one of the changes we need is actually for the exams themselves to reflect not just relative ranking, but absolute knowledge, right? So today, what you focus on is the cutoff for admissions, right? So again, what is the media attention on is what is the cutoff for admissions to different prestigious colleges, right? Whereas and this is true at every level, right? So I remember talking to a former finance minister who, when he presented some data, he said, oh, even today, like in our village, we have one child from a government school, like children from government school are going to IIT and IIS. And that just reflects the fact that as a system, we obsess on the right tail, right? So if you go to a teacher in a village and ask about their 20 years of teaching, they'll remember the one kid who made it big from the village and who's now working in the Silicon Valley and sending money back to the school. But the thousands of children who kind of remained functionally illiterate and could have been moved from knowing nothing to being able to read and having a better future is something that's not even in their kind of frame of thinking about, their goals and what they're trying to do. So to get there, one part of this is the curriculum and teaching at the right level, but the other part is also the exam system, that we need to be able to communicate to parents, teachers, children, and the system as to what is the absolute learning level, right? So if you just say, are you able to do this, sort of like what Pratham's doing, I think that's what starts shifting this 800 megaton aircraft carrier towards this developmental paradigm as opposed to a sorting paradigm, right? So I think that's one piece I wanted to say. On private schools, again, like Rukmini said, it is, so what we did was this very large scale RCT looking at what happens when you took kids from low income government schools and gave them a voucher to go to a private school, and we tracked them over 4 years. And what you see, like Rukmini said, is for the most part that the private schools, and again, I'm talking about the low cost budget private schools, that for the most part are not that much better. Okay, so the Tesco gains are very modest, if anything. And so the difference between public and private schools is, one is the parents, but the other big thing is that the private schools typically have 2 extra years of schooling, that they have LKG and UKG. And so, whereas the government schooling system starts in class 1. So if I go and compare kids in class 2 or class 3 across public and private schools, you're literally comparing double the amount of education in the private schools because they've had 2 extra years of schooling. So it's 4 versus 2. Okay. So, which is why when you do the RCT and control for all of these things, you find that the effects are relatively modest. Now, this is not to say that private schools are not doing something right. See, because what they do right is they're much more cost effective, right? So they deliver the same gains, but at a much lower cost per child. And that's because they pay much lower teacher salaries and these teachers are more accountable, they're able to hire more teachers. So I think the larger question we need to ask ourselves, and where I think there is merit in pushing on the public dimension, but not in a naive kind of, oh, just give vouchers and the problem will take care of itself. See, what the private sector has shown is that they can do management and governance much, much better. Okay, so we have a recent paper looking at management practices within schools, and the private sectors, particularly on personnel management, right? Are you able to motivate your teachers, reward them, hire them well, and hold them accountable? On personnel management, the private schools do much, much better. So I think the larger question here is, what would happen if you were to leverage private management with a similar level of per child funding and saying, how much further could you go? I think, but my view on this is that we are not ready for anything close to like a large scale voucher type system for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think what would make sense is to do some pilots of charter school models, right? Whereby you have, like Ajay was saying, you have high quality civil society organizations that are running good schools, that are motivated in the public interest, but may be willing to kind of do management contracts of public schools. But here's the important thing. I think like Rukmini was saying, the problem with private schools is that private schools are also fundamentally clubs. Okay, they're defined as much by who they exclude as who they include, right? So if you want to use private schools to improve outcomes, you need a charter type model where you still cannot do selective admission or that you're not charging any fees. So I have a whole paper on kind of the state and the market in the delivery of education and how you architect a system whereby you can improve both public and private quality. I think the other basic thing on the private side that the government should do is frankly just kind of modify the structure of regulation, right? Because see, like it or not, so Rukmini is 100% right. For those of us who care about the, essentially equity and making sure that all children are at a basic level, the action is all in the government schools, okay? Because that's where the most disadvantaged 50% of the population are. So from a government perspective, from an ethical perspective, from a research perspective, in many ways, that's where we should be focusing our attention, and that's what we're doing. But from the larger perspective of education quality, the government can also do much better simply by regulating in a smarter way. Okay, so right now the private schools are mainly subject to input-based mandates, and these input mandates are often completely unproductive and lead to a very corrosive status quo where, because you cannot meet these mandates, the legitimate private guys who could run good schools at scale kind of go out of business, and the ones who remain are the ones who are willing to grease the palms so that the regulator is looking away. So you could do a lot better in promoting the private ecosystem by simply making regulation as a function of disclosure as opposed to mandates, right? So as long as schools are telling the truth about their teacher qualifications and what they're doing, you should let them be and let kind of parents figure that out and kind of reduce the heavy-handed input-based mandate of private schools or regulation. But that's a whole separate topic, and we can talk more about that.
Thank you, Karthik. Yes, indeed, we do have many questions, so we will have to carry on. I want to go first beyond Ajay to get to Frank Wang, who's president of Scholastic Asia, who's in the audience. And he asked the question, do you see technology playing a role to help address the issue? Streaming is playing a key role to upgrade rural education in China. I'll run it out to whoever answers it.
Yeah, so let me take that. And, thanks for the Q&A for letting me cover topics I didn't have time for. So I think EdTech is massively promising, okay? And so for a whole bunch of reasons, including, being able to have high quality instruction to all kids, preventing the knowledge of the teacher from being a constraint, allowing customizing of instruction, quickening the feedback loop between what a student does and the feedback they get. And so there's tons and tons of reasons why EdTech should be great in theory. The problem is when you go look at the data and when you go look at high quality evidence, you'll see that the evidence is all over the place. Okay, so you have studies that find massive positive effects, you have studies that find zero effects, and you have studies that find negative effects. Okay, and so I think, so for example, a very, very high profile one laptop per child program in Peru was evaluated with an RCT, and they found zero impacts on learning outcomes. And if you look at the national EdTech policy, and this is not just India, right? This is in every country, is that the focus of EdTech ends up being much more on procurement and providing input. So where is the money for the computer labs? Okay. And in fact, in Romania, we have evidence from a study that gave computers to middle school kids where the learning outcomes were negative because they were all playing games. Okay, so which is not surprising. But I think the point, therefore, is that you really have to pay attention to the details of how do you integrate the technology and the pedagogy. Okay, so on the positive side, some of the most striking positive effects we've seen in education research also come from technology. And so this is an RCT we did that's published in the AER a couple of years ago of this program called MindSpark, which is an individually customized computer learning program. And I think the reason it's so effective is mainly because it's doing what Rukmini says, but doing it in a kind of at a larger scale for secondary students. And there's this other stunning graph in that paper you'll see. Remember that picture I showed you about the variation of where the kids are, and what the software is able to do is it's able to give you content at exactly the level at which you are. And so when you do that, we see exactly what Rukmini says, that you get kind of a grade level equivalent of learning in as little as 3 to 4 months. Okay, so but the key is that it's not the technology, is that are you using the technology to alleviate a binding constraint? And that's why you need to first understand, get into the black box and see where the constraints really are, and then design your technology intervention to alleviate that. Now let me say something else about technology. It's not just about pedagogy. I'm also massively excited about the potential for technology in governance. Okay, so my colleague and co-author Abhijit Singh has this very nice recent paper on kind of administrative data integrity. And so part of the problem, my big concern now is, as a national policy, we say we are going to do foundational learning and numeracy, literacy numeracy, and the teachers in the administrative data have a very strong incentive to show that this has happened. Okay, and Rukmini's got many anecdotes of this. And so what Abhijit shows is that in this high quality administrative data on learning outcomes, when they go do an independent audit of retesting the same kids on the same questions, that the true learning level is about half of that. Okay, and what he also shows is that using tablets to do assessments in a real-time way dramatically improve data integrity, and that's because you get a lot more real-time quality control in the data. So the other point about technology, which is worth highlighting, is that technology helps us improve not just pedagogy but also governance, because it gives us real-time visibility into what the child is doing and is the child learning. And I can talk a lot more about that, but I think I'm very excited about technology, but it needs to be directed towards addressing the binding constraints of pedagogy and governance, as opposed to saying let's give laptops and magic will happen.
Great.
If I can just, so I think that this last year or so has produced a lot of very interesting examples of what should be potentially tried both in the low-tech space and perhaps in the high-tech space as well. Because if you're going to teach exactly what you were teaching in the classroom, but just on a online class or through an app, I think that's just one more input. But if you were able to use devices and place it on social structures that actually unleash a different kind of learning and enable different kinds of processes, then I think that's a very, very exciting space. We, the Pratham's digital work, we call it hybrid learning. And there what we are doing is using technology to enable children to have experiences that they couldn't have had otherwise. So for example, I'll just give you a very quick example. There are shared devices. These devices are shared among groups of children outside the school, partly outside the school because the school is a very rigid space and doesn't allow enough room for experimentation or iteration. Kids have to decide who's in the group. Kids have to decide when they're going to meet, and kids have to decide and choose what pathway they want to take through what is the menu available to them. And the menu available to them could be academic, it could be music, it could be whatever. In UP, where we have a large number of these laboratory villages, school attendance is 60% plus minus on any given day. Group attendance, where the children have to come together themselves, is very, very high. So where does choice, where does collaboration, learning is not, we need to learn how to read and write, and I'm the first person to say so, but I think we need a lot other skills which can be perhaps made possible with the right kinds of social support. We also see that this divide between home and school, when you go into one of our hybrid learning villages, it's like a saturation village. Every kid belongs to some group, and that group has to share a shared device, but people in the village can tell you exactly what the kids are doing right now. The same people, if you ask them, what is your child learning in the school, they may point to a book, but they don't have an idea of how to get in. So I think that the potential of technology, digital process, all of this to open up and actually bring the school and the home, bring learning and the home closer together is also very high. I'm hoping that, just as we come out of having had these many, many different experiences, there will be a lot more research on the combinations. We've seen in India, we've, for example, done a lot of work on SMS. What kind of a little package of activity can you send out in 160 characters or whatever the limit is? And there as well, we find, reaching parents at the right level is almost as important as teaching at the right level. So an SMS message which says, how much water did the family use yesterday? How many buckets do you think are needed for washing or cooking? Gets massive amount of parent help as compared to what's an isosceles triangle. Now, that I think is also an indication about not just how you learn, but what you learn and how is that put in front of if you want a learning society, you've got to have not just textbooks and exams and teachers and rows and columns and so on, but you need to engage this, 1 billion people, all of whom know a lot, to come into this learning process. So I think I'm also I think we've been forced to look at all these other options, which we may not have done if all the schools were open and all the textbooks were open. And because it was shut, I think we've been forced to look at a lot of other things. And that's been hopefully a very good experience for us. The technology can be a trigger for a very different kind of transformed learning, rather than just doing my sums better and better on the same tablet.
And in fact, in the spirit of Jugalbandi, right? So, which is because you riff off. So let me amplify everything Rukmini said and say, something just again coming back to the research. See, I think the big COVID moment, the big COVID opportunity for me is taking off on the two things that Rukmini said, right? So one is kind of scaling up the technology adoption, and the second bigger one is what we can do with parents, right? So if you go back to the Coleman report, this legendary, famous report on education in the US in 1960s, right? One of the punchlines of that, which was kind of very sobering and depressing, was that essentially it said that, listen, 80 to 90% of the variation in learning is a function of household characteristics, right? Because it's the parents who are the first teachers who are transmitting education. And so the reason that was seen as very depressing is because as policymakers, we always thought that the space we had to work with was only the schools, okay? So if there's 80% of what matters to the child is something that is outside your kind of sphere of influence, then there's very little you can do. I mean, you can try, you can still do some stuff, okay? But obviously government can't go change parents, and that's what it is. But the main, if you think about the long arc of education, the problem that the schools solved was the last mile problem, that it is so much more costly to reach the household than it is to bring 20 children to a school and teach them there, okay? But what the technology has allowed you to do is allowed you to reach the household directly. So whether it's SMS-based interventions and whether it's kind of WhatsApp-based groups where you're kind of channeling the right social dynamics, where we are starting to see a lot of innovation, and Abhijit and I have some ongoing research on this. So I'm very, very excited about that. So hopefully, if done well, and sorry, I must go back to what Rukmini said, that I should discuss Jishnu's study. And so Jishnu is, in DC, and has this very, very important paper because, and it's a paper looking at education outcomes in the natural disaster. So it's looking at the Pakistan earthquake of 2005. And what they find is, so there are kids who are just affected and not affected. And the schools, everything basically breaks down, and kids are out of school for a few months. Now, what was really interesting about that program is that the quality of recovery aid was very, very good. Okay, so it was high profile. They got their aid money. The schools were rebuilt. The houses were rebuilt. Everything was rebuilt. Okay, but 4 years later, when they went back and tracked the learning outcomes in those affected cohorts, what they found was that even though the household income had recovered, that the learning outcomes for the children whose mothers were illiterate were permanently lower 4 years later, whereas those who had literate mothers were able to catch up. Okay, so and it's a way of reinforcing multiple threads here, right? That the COVID crisis, the COVID thing is a real crisis, and it's kind of ironic that as a country we have woken up to foundational literacy and numeracy in the year of COVID when you've actually gone back. Okay, so we're now going to have to work hard just to get back to that starting point. But the opportunity is that it has potentially allowed us to leapfrog in terms of the basic technology adoption, because now it's the only game in town. And so, even parents are willing to let their children use their phones for whatever educational content. So that's one piece. But it's also, I think, created a ton of engagement on the supply side about how do you reach households, and hopefully that will persist, and that we will kind of, take a 360-degree approach to our education problem that is not just about what we do in those 5 hours in the school, but think about this as a continuous, all hands on deck mission for the country. So I just wanted to reinforce everything that Rukmini said.
Great. Thank you so much, Karthik. We do have many questions, so let's try and keep everything brief here. This is from Thomas Timberg. Has anyone addressed the legendary role of the traditional school inspectors? Someone who remembers their incredible effect on village primary schools in the 1960s, and also goes on to ask, has anyone looked at comparison with China data on dramatic impact of eye screening and glasses on rural primary school students? Who wants to go after that?
I think on the school inspector side, again, I think these are sort of, big shifts within a school system. Whether it is the inspection system, the procurement system, the measurement of the data systems, are all coming from a time when schooling was expanding really fast and you needed to account for things and inspect things in a particular way. And you were largely inspecting inputs or provision or enrollment. We are at a point right now where all these systems need to change to be able to support learning, which is different. You cannot just go off with one checklist and look at how these things happen. The way that, and I'm particularly, particularly interested in how measurement systems have to change, whether you call it assessment, whether you call it, learning. How do you track that and how do you support it? Because you're tracking it not just for the sake of tracking. Hopefully you're tracking it to improve it, to revise it, to modify it. And there I feel that that person who's above the school level, above the level of the teacher, is a very, very critical person, because that's the person who has the direct and ongoing contact with the school. But that person is in a very hierarchical system and has been used to inspecting textbooks, midday meals, bathrooms, attendance. And I want them now. And I have like a whole ton of stories, as you can imagine, which I don't want to bore people with. But I think that the real trick, and in the teaching at the right level, approach that we use. So it's not so much the pedagogy as the organization of the structure that supports this movement from schooling to learning. One of the simple things we do is to say that the level above the teacher has to first practice what they're going to do with the teacher. So if you are going to do this basic reading and math program and you're going to run it with your teachers, firstly, nobody should train somebody else until they've done it themselves. And if you do it yourself, then you know what is the benchmark that we are chasing. So the UP example that I showed had this leaders of practice, not inspectors, leaders of practice, leaders of learning. That's the shift that we want to do. And when they ran their classes, often unwillingly to begin with, but then you get seduced because children's progress is very seductive and very infectious. So the way they talk changes. In the beginning, they would say, oh, poor children, have so many disadvantages, they can't learn. And within 10 days, once the child has made a little bit of progress, they'll say, Ajay couldn't read, and now he's actually piecing words together. It's no longer children, it's no longer the aggregate. There is a focus on the individual. These are the things that underlie learning. These are the things that push progress. And in UP, I remember making a case to a senior government official saying that in 20 days' time, there is a 20 percentage point difference in the ability of children to read. So, dear sir, how many days will it take to get to 100%? And he just automatically said 100 days. And I said, that's it. That's what you need. And we are not talking about this from, thin air. It's because the leaders of practice have been able to show the pace. So they should be able to say to their teachers that if I could do this, how much can you do? So there has been some research done by Yamini Iyer from the Center for Policy Research on these, what she calls frontline workers. But for over and over again, we feel that it's not the curriculum package, it's not the input, it is really who is leading this charge on learning, how many people feel it's possible. I mean, one of the reasons to show the slides I did was to say how many people in this audience believe that it's possible to have a significant, massive change if we do things differently.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me go on to another line of questioning. So Priya Agarwal asks, dropouts are expected to be at a very high level, especially middle school and upwards. What do you think needs to be done to deal with this? I mean, this can impact the skilling of the economy and huge gaps increasing. On a similar note, Manju Rani asks about remedial classes. They become a permanent feature rather than a temporary catch-up to remedy a situation, as there's no system to take over after remediation is done. What's the long-term effect of remedial classes? And he went on. We have a question also by Manju Rani on were the gains during summer camp sustained? So what's the impact of summer camp? I'll leave that with whoever wants to go after it.
I'll
Yeah, I
just
think
take the
Rukmini, no, I think Rukmini should take all of those, and I will come back to answer the China question, which we didn't.
Excellent idea.
Okay, so I would say that the what is remedial? I am actually opposed to the word remedial. Remedial means that there was something wrong. I think that the way our curriculum is structured, it's an overambitious curriculum created at a time and for a different kind of target population. We really need to rethink what is it that children need to learn and at what pace and how. And therefore, I prefer the word learning support or catch up. But the catch up means that there is one catch up, and then if you're going to get up to grade level and it's harder to change the grade level curriculum, then you need to think about what to do once the kids have passed the basic stage, and then the next stage, and then it's sort of like a ladder. And you've got to think continuously about getting to the ladder. It's a different question that the ladder rungs need to be brought to some other place. And so it's unfair on children, unfair on teachers, and unfair on parents to be chasing this ladder, which is way too steep and not clear where it's headed. So I would say that this catch-up should put in place that as soon as I've achieved a certain goal that we as a school system think can be achieved, create the next goal and then create the supporting structures to be able to reach that goal. On the durability of the learning gains, we are quite busy measuring these, because when you gain quickly, do you slide back again or not? And we certainly see, and this fits in with a lot of research that was done on literacy earlier, that the slide back, even if I take the ASER tool, going from letters to words, there's a chance you'll slide back. By the time you reach and you're reading a story and you've been reading consistently for a period of time, the slide back is much, much smaller. We do see, and we see this in the US as well, there is a summer drop, but the drop doesn't go all the way down, and the catch up is much faster. So it's not a linear, I think learning progress is often not linear. There are jagged edges, but it's a definite upward curve. JPAL has done some studies on the learning gains and then what happens afterwards. And overall, the drop is overall, broadly, these are much more durable gains if you've been at it for a while. So, 100 days, another 100 days, reading material at home, grandma asking you what you can read, all of these signboards. If you look at, for example, for those of you who are from India, you see very good signboards which are designed for people who are learning to read versus things that nobody's ever going to read. So Airtel, which is one of our phone companies, has lots and lots of ads which are very, very simple, no complicated words. And those are the kinds. So I think as a country, if you want to support foundational learning, look around at your signage, change that, look at what books are available, change that. It's a much bigger cultural shift to support this kind of thing. So as a country, we need remediation to be good to our kids. That's what I would say. It's not just a curriculum thing.
Karthik, you take it from here, but I want to add one more question on the China side. How does the situation regarding sorting and filtering differ between India and, say, China or Korea? So add that in.
Yeah, so I'll say two things on China and then say one thing about parents. So I think I don't know the micro details of the Chinese education system, but the one fact that is really striking, that is worth highlighting, is if you look at decentralization, China has over 50% of its expenditure at local government level. So Devesh Kapoor, who was, I think, on this program a couple of episodes ago, has this JEP paper where he shows that over 60% of employees in the Chinese public, in the government, are local, whereas in India, most of those are at the state level. So I think one key difference in terms of governance at the grassroots level is how much more local communities own and control what's going on in their schools. Compared to India, where because we have taken the opposite approach of saying that you need to get the most qualified teacher. So we recruit the teachers in these kind of very competitive civil service exams, but then they are hired at the district level and are transferred. So, and the teachers never live in the community. So what we see in our data is part of the reason for why you have high levels of teacher absence is that the government school teacher, almost 90% of them have their own kids in private schools, and they live 10 to 12 kilometers away and they're commuting to the village. So the fact that the teacher's social distance, so in trying to find a qualified, highly paid teacher, you've also increased the social distance between the teacher and the community. And I think that's something about China versus India that's worth reflecting on, because we think of China as this big, strong state. But in practice, for all the functions that matter for citizens, it is way more decentralized with much more local control. And that directly plays into governance. I think the question about human development versus sorting. And I think this is the important part about China, right? So the interpretation of what I said about sorting should not be interpreted as saying that we give up sorting, because every society will demand sorting in one form or the other, right? So, and this is true everywhere in the world, because there's always fewer places in the most prestigious institutes of higher education, and you need some way of allocating those spots. The problem sometime in India is you get well-intentioned policies that are actually quite quite misguided. So you had, as part of the RTE, an attempt to get rid of the 10th standard board exam, saying that this creates too much pressure. But that backfires, because the elite kids will find other ways to signal that they belong in a top college. So they will take international boards, they will take other ways to show that they belong in a top place. Whereas and it's the same thing that goes with the SAT debate in the US, is that sometimes these high stakes tests become the only way for kind of less advantaged kids to show that they belong. So I think you'll still need the sorting the way you have in China with the Gaokao. I think the big difference in India is that we have the sorting, but we give up if you're below that level, right? So if you're below that, we have nothing to offer you. And that's the real problem. Whereas what you see in China is that they manage to get a universal level of basic skills going. And that's then, you also see and this is not causal, but you see the pattern of how you invest in education show up in the structure of the larger economy, right? So India does very, very well in skill-intensive manufacturing in a global setting, and that's because we invested in tertiary education way before we did universal primary education, right? Whereas China manages to kind of catch the low skill, labor-intensive pathway to broad-based development, and that's partly because your entire workforce has a certain basic level of skills that allows them to be productive. So I think the key thing in China is not that they do less sorting, but they do also make sure that the left tail is kind of pushed up to a certain minimum standard. And I think Vietnam has a similar story. So let me come back to parents, and going back to what Rukmini was saying, this all hands on deck approach. So one of the things which I believe there's evidence on and is starting to be scaled up is this idea by a professor at IIM Ahmedabad called Bridge Kothari, called same language subtitling. Okay, so the question here is, how do you get mothers and parents who are illiterate? How do you leapfrog their education, given that they're outside the school system? And one simple idea, just like Rukmini was talking about the quality of the signage, is that everybody knows their Bollywood songs, and people know their songs, they know their words, and so you can literally have karaoke, right? So you play this on TV, and the words are being kind of spelt out at the same time, so you know what the syllables are because you're also hearing it, and they highlight it at the same time. So I believe this is now being scaled up in some states and some channels, and I have a student who's now doing some RCT, testing RCTs on the effectiveness of same language subtitling, because with the parents' generation, you have the auditory skills and you know what the words mean, and so you just need to match that to the syllables in the reading. Let me say a final thing on this, which is, and again, everything I'm saying is then connecting to research studies back to the big questions, is Ajay Banerji and co-authors have this very, very nice paper recently on what they call street math. Okay, so then there's this simple fact that if you give a child, and so what they do is that they look at street vendors, okay, and children who have dropped out of school and are selling things on the street, and the experiment is very simple, that you give the child 100 rupees when you bought something that cost 25 rupees, and this child will automatically make the change and give you 75 rupees back, okay? But if you take that same child and give them a question on a piece of paper and do 100 minus 25, and that's something they have no idea how to do, okay? And so the point is that there's a lot of tacit knowledge that people have in how they function that is not recognized in our formal learning systems. And so ways of kind of drawing in on the tacit knowledge in a way that connects informal and formal are also things that would make a lot of sense as we take an all hands on deck approach to this problem.
Right, so I'll have one clarifying question and two more final questions, if you don't mind. And if anyone wants to riff on previous stuff, that's fine as well. Abhilasha Sahe from the World Bank, formerly of GW, asks, this is a clarifying question, what's going on? 70% are under grade, grade 3, and 50% on grade 5. How is this? It seems the reverse to what you would expect. If someone wants to jump in with that, that would be great.
Yeah, very simple. The ASER tool, the highest level is a second grade level. In grade 3, only 27% of kids are at that level. By grade 5, 50% of the kids are at that level. And so as you go older, obviously, but the thing to remember is all the kids who are not at that level. And because it's a floor test, you are at least at second grade level, you may be at, higher.
Thanks for clarifying that. I was curious as well. And now a big question from Ajay Mehta. It seems that the approach being taken to improve education is a technocratic one. Is it not time to locate education in the context of making schools the sites of democracy, where both teachers and students are treated as ends in themselves and not learning? So that's kind of, if I would say, maybe a SEN capability-based approach to rethinking through. Maybe that's what you already are using. And then one more question, which was, yes, from Priyanka Singh. Aren't we relying too much on RCTs? With all its limitations of testing, only discrete elements and time, etc., for solutions. In my experience, she says, RCTs are useful for rejecting interventions which may not work. So she's just wanting to know, is there something beyond that that we can go after? So please respond first, and then I'll turn it over to Karthik.
So I'm going to respond because I'm not a JPAL affiliate in that sense. I think that you've got to use data of all kinds. And really, the directions that you're going in, should certainly be directions that the RCT points to. It should be data that other people are other methods being collected. And it's also what makes sense when teachers or parents are looking at things and, figuring it out. And so what the ASER data, the way directions it's pointing, it's absolutely very simple data collected, discussed at a very basic level, seems to corroborate what, very gold standard data says. The real thing underlying this is not so much the RCT or other kinds of studies or administrative data. It is that as a culture in India, we don't have enough of this analytic measurement capability. Or everybody has an opinion. We have a billion people and we have 100 billion opinions, but the opinions are usually backed by your grandmother's experience or your niece rather than on. And we see this at the village level, that how do you bring the aggregate and the individual, your anecdote, closer together? And I think we need to do a lot more on getting people to think systematically on aggregates, which are not colored and influenced by the, one grandchild you had that didn't learn to read or whatever. So I think that a lot more empirical evidence is needed. We need much more systematically collected evidence. We need it discussed a lot, more. I don't want to get into what is happening with, data and so on in India right now. But these need to be part of your, your mental makeup from early on in life. And that's when you learn how to, look at numbers as a symbolic of a bigger story that is behind.
Karthik.
Yeah, so I think, let me I'll take the second one first and then end on the bigger note of the philosophical point about, what schools should be. So again, let me agree with everything Rukmini said. I think with RCTs, the point here is not to just say there's only RCTs. There's tons and tons of data. I think the issue really is, like Rukmini says, is the representativeness of the data and moving to a culture where you're forcing yourself to look at what's happening in every part of the distribution and not just kind of obsessing at the top. And again, anytime there's a change in the admissions rule for St. Stephen's College, it'll be in the cover story of the Delhi edition of the newspapers. But the nationwide learning crisis will show up only once a year when you get the ASER report, right? Because otherwise there's no other salience on that. So I think a big part of this is just focusing on asking the right questions and measuring that. I think the RCT, movement itself is expanding very broadly into the range of questions being asked, right? So I think the limitations of RCTs in some ways is more about what are the kind of questions that you can ask. But in education, given that so many of the interventions are modular at the level of kind of students or classrooms or teachers or schools, it actually gives you the Now, would I say you need RCTs for macroeconomics? No, you're not going to randomize interest rates. But given that you're going to roll out programs anyway, this is a place where you can learn with better evidence. So then why not? So it's not like saying we don't need other things, but when you can get more credible evidence, why not? And I think, And like you've seen, in a way, and this applies to economics more generally, right? Which is, as a discipline, I don't think we're too kind of dogmatic about what we study, as long as we can measure it, right? So the key is, so we're happy to study behavioral interventions, we're happy to study street math, we're happy to study things that are very much outside the domain of economics, as long as it's credibly measured. So I think where in education we need to do a lot more work is on measurement. So to go back to EdTech, for example, maybe we're thinking about the impacts completely incorrectly in terms of impact on literacy and numeracy. Whereas we should be thinking about the impact of technology in terms of, are you not about information retrieval, but are you able to find new information quickly if I give you a new and unfamiliar question? Because the whole point of using technology to direct your own searches and assess the quality of sources is, can you become a self-learner with the technology? So maybe we're not measuring this the right way, and I think there's a lot more work to be done on that. I think this larger question about technocratic intervention versus, like, schools as democratic spaces. It's interesting, because if you go back to the constitutional debates in India, one of the central issues that was debated was the amount of decentralization, right? So, one way to kind of get to the ideal that is talked about making schools local democratic spaces would be to give communities a lot more control. The problem is we also have this countervailing force where the founding leaders of the constitutional movement were also really, really concerned about social reform, and were concerned that if you decentralize too much, local elites would simply not allow mass education to historically underprivileged groups. And so the decision was taken at that point, partly, Ambedkar, Nehru, and the giants of the constitutional movement. And Ambedkar has this very famous quote about the village kind of being like a den of all of India's social vices. And so I think there was a constitutional moment that led us to over-centralize, but that over-centralizing has also created a technocratic system without, I think, re-engaging communities and taking ownership of their schools as learning spaces, as local public spaces. And, I think Kerala might be an interesting place to go look at to see how it functions differently. But this is a very, very hard question. I think I'm very sympathetic to local control, but I'm also very sympathetic to kind of the impulse that drove that over-centralization. So, I mean, to just bring this very locally here in the US, okay? The US Constitution gives a lot more power to states than the federal government, right? But when we need to kind of make sure that post-Reconstruction, that you have universal voting rights, you need a federal voting rights act, because you don't trust the states that were historically marginalizing their slave populations would in fact give the vote. And so you have the federal intervention that kind of, contravenes the local space. So these are very difficult issues in terms of balancing local autonomy and, the higher level interest in making sure that you don't perpetuate local inequalities. But I do think there is a strong case to be made for reclaiming schools as local spaces that communities own.
Well, I want to thank our audience for holding on. We've gone over by quite a bit. I do want to see if my colleague Ajay Chhibber wants to say one word in final comment before we check out.
I mean, this was like Jugalbandi of the highest order. That's all I would say. Thank you so much, Rukmini. Thank you so much, Karthik. And thank you, James, for chairing this.
My pleasure. And thanks, audience, for sticking with us. And until next time from Washington, D.C.